From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Hello, and welcome once again to Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis with another discussion about Chicago and politics in Chicago and all the things that are relevant to us. I must say, before we even begin, though, that something about it seems almost absurd to be having a conversation about these things when all of us are transfixed with what's going on very far away, as I'm sure I'm not the only one who's been sitting up till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning watching these live feeds coming in from the troubled nuclear plant in Japan and wondering what is going to happen. Our job, though, is to focus on local issues, and that's what we're going to do for the next half hour. But we just want to say that, of course, we're thinking a lot about what's going on halfway around the world. And also, another quick mention, it's worthy of mentioning today that as we start our program today, Jim Tyree has just passed away. Those of us who love journalism in Chicago would certainly owe him a debt of gratitude, because he was a guy who believed that the Sun-Times was worth saving, that you could actually make some money with it, and he was on his way to making something like that happen. And we just hope that the people who will succeed Jim Tyree will carry on. So there's a somber way to begin our program today, huh? Let's try to see if we can kind of pick things up here. We have some true experts with us today, and we're going to try to focus most of our attention today on labor. Not just Chicago firefighters and Chicago teachers and all that, but what it means for them that there's a new administration, and whether or not what we've been seeing all around the country, particularly in Wisconsin, will have echoes here in Chicago. Does it mean anything if you're a firefighter living in Chicago and you're watching what's going on in Madison and Milwaukee? Well, we have some people who can really, truly help us figure that out, because I've seen too much of this kind of tossed off commentary about, well, Rah Emanuel is this or Rah Emanuel is that. We're going to really try to figure some of that out today with David Moberg. Dave Moberg is here joining us today for the first time. He's with In These Times and been covering labor for a good number of years. And
right.
I'm really proud to have you on the show today. Bob Bruno is with us from the University of Illinois. Bob is a historian, a labor historian in Illinois, and has had a number of connections with CAN TV in the past, and we're really glad to have you on our show for the first time. Also, David Schaper from National Public Radio, Chicago reporter, old friend of mine, and a guy who has spent some time, they sort of dispatched you up to create the Madison Bureau for a while there. All three of our guests have spent some time up in Madison in the last few weeks, and I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation about what that's going to mean here in Chicago. And, along the way, maybe we'll be able to put it into some perspective about what it means that we're going to be able to build that south runway at O'Hare and are Illinois' nuclear reactors safe, and some of the other questions that are on the table. But I want to just get started right away with the question that has been on my mind, and I think a lot of other people's minds. We're seeing 75, 80, 100, 150,000 people showing up in Madison. There are mass rallies there. I can't help but wonder if that's not sort of 100% of that cohort in what appears to be a slowly dying and changing zeitgeist in the United States of America, and that the rest of Wisconsin is just kind of quietly sitting back saying, these guys are out of step. We don't want these public unions anymore, and we're glad that we've got a governor who's killing them off. Let's start in the negative way.
Well, the polls don't seem to indicate that. The polls, especially as the demonstrations have gone on, have shifted to decreasing support for the governor, increasing support for collective bargaining. And it's turning out a remarkable number of people who never went to any kind of protest before in their lives and never thought of themselves as anybody who would march around carrying a sign, let alone making up their own signs and bringing them.
I know some of those, by the way. I as we were mentioning just a few moments ago, I have good friends, a number of good friends who live in Wisconsin, and some of them are in public sector jobs. And I would never in a million years have imagined them like creating giant signs and marching around, but they're doing it. So.
Well, I think one of the other variables that's playing out here is that, prior to the governor's budget, being presented, the focus was on what was happening specifically to public sector workers. And one would have expected some mobilizing on behalf of unions. But then the budget comes out, and the agricultural community and the small farmers got very upset. And you had school boards across the state upset about what was going to happen to education. There was a lot of pain in that budget. And given that farm labor history in Wisconsin, so there's a new group, a new coalition that's forming, and some of those folks are even talking about running for state office. So I think it's far from dying down. I think that pain has spread. And I think the opposition is spread.
And now there's a lot of talk about, well, I'm sorry, Dave.
Well, I was just going to add that I really do think that this has struck a nerve outside of Madison in a way that a lot of previous issues and protests that have happened in Madison, which has a rich tradition of that, haven't struck a chord outside of through the rest of the state. That said, there is a bit of a divide in the state, and there's, I think, a growing divide between those people who feel they've had to shoulder the brunt of this economic recession. This the manufacturing jobs have been disappearing. Those jobs that have been kept, the wages are going down, the benefits are going down, and there is a sense. I've talked to people in Janesville and further north in the state where there have been massive job losses and other cuts to pay and benefits, where they're saying, we've lost this. Why isn't anybody else? Why should they get to keep their benefits? There is a little bit of a strain there and a divide in Wisconsin that I've went to school up there. I've got a lot of family in Wisconsin, and I haven't seen this sharp, this bitter of a divide. Maybe
It's
going
always
back
been-
to the progressive era clashing up against the
It's always
McCarthy.
been a very divided state, though, politically. I mean,
It has. I mean, you
It's
have
the state of Joe McCarthy as
Right.
well as
Robert
Russ
Lafayette.
Feingold.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But now, of course, there's a lot of talk about recall, so we may be seeing a lot of political activity for a long time there.
And there's a Supreme Court election coming up in April, just a couple of weeks from now. And usually Supreme Court elections are not political bellwethers, but in this case it really is going to be, because I think you're going to see more people just showing up out of sheer frustration, which we did not have in November. The reason this is happening is because the Republicans won, and people talk about,
And Democrats stayed home.
That's just it. How did this big sea change happen? Governor Walker won his position in November with fewer votes than the losing candidate John McCain got in the presidential race in 2010. So therefore, it wasn't this massive sea change of public opinion. We thought we wanted change with Obama. Now we want change with a guy like Governor Walker. It's just that those who, for whatever reason, were behind Obama and the Democrats in 2010 just weren't energized, weren't.
Well, there was some of
coming out to
that.
vote.
There was some of that, but also, I mean, every off-year election, there's a downturn in voter turnout.
Always,
That's always the case. And I think there was a lot of motivation for the right wing out of the Tea Party movement that gave them the kind of energy going into this of anti-Obama.
Well, they're new on the scene. They got to show. They got to come in big. They got to make a big splash quickly.
And to be honest, Walker doesn't get elected, nor does the state assembly and state senate flip the way it does, without independent and, quite frankly, labor union votes. I mean, and there's a lot of buyer's remorse that's out there. Well, we understood. David accurately talks about that tension between private sector and public sector, and so we understand that, well, maybe there has to be some rebalancing of their contributions to healthcare and such. But we didn't expect an attack on an institution like collective bargaining, and that has sort of reconfigured the response.
I wouldn't overstate that sense of divide. I mean, for one thing, we all have our anecdotal experiences like that of talking to people who have that resentment. I don't recall seeing any polling that is really asked that question, so we don't have kind of more scientific data to go on. And a lot of working class people are conservatives. They don't all vote Democratic anyway, and so a lot of those may feel that resentment. I think, one of the things that's surprising is, how much support there has been from private sector workers, showing up and
Yeah.
Well, you know what, David,
Right.
you wrote in one of your recent pieces in These Times, need to give a plug for In These Times, that's where he works. One of your recent pieces you wrote, and this is, I grossly shortened it, but you said the state of, you were talking, I think you were talking about Wisconsin, I hope it wasn't Illinois, but I think the thing happens for both states. You said the state is neither poor nor profligate, but spineless. And I think you were probably talking about Illinois in that
Yes.
case. But it really applies in so many ways to Wisconsin too. I mean, Wisconsin is not a broke state, as far as I understand it. I mean, sure, they've got some huge budget imbalances because, like everybody else, they got hit with the financial waves that came in. But this notion that that our states are so broke, and that it has something to do with the fact that we have for so long been spending so much money on dental plans for our teachers and our firefighters, seems almost irrational to me, I have to say.
Well, I would agree. I mean, and I think that the part of the problem is that people aren't willing to face up to what they need from the public sector, and they, you know, their lives would be much worse without the public sector, and a lot of them appreciate the things that are done, whether it's, you know, from police or firemen on down to people who, you know, handle driver's license and the rest. But, you know, it's something that they don't expect to pay for. Even more than that, there's a problem that, especially over the last couple of decades, the vast majority of new income generated in this country has gone to the top 1%,
Yeah.
and even more to the top 5%.
Right.
And a system like ours that has no progressive qualities to our income tax doesn't capture where the money is. And so we are rich in that sense, except it's become increasingly skewed, and we haven't been in a position to go after the money that we need for the state.
You look troubled.
Well, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what David said, but in addition to having a really screwed up and dysfunctional and, quite frankly, unfair tax system, Illinois being a perfect example of that, you have a state like Wisconsin, and certainly Ohio is another one, in which the governors came in and found tax breaks in the millions of dollars for corporate investment, for business, and then yelled and screamed that they had enormous budget shortfalls that required draconian action. So, you know, on one hand, you have this huge issue, this shortfall. On the other hand, you're giving away large sums of money to businesses with very little, you know, ask in return. Oh, I would agree. I don't think these states are broke, and I suspect as the economy starts to come back and the market starts to come back and these pension funds start to grow again, you know, you'll see relatively quickly this happen.
I mean, that I think is an important point, because the pension funds look very troubled right now.
Right.
But one of the main reasons they're troubled is because of that collapse of the stock market. Well, I mean, that is returning to a large extent, and we haven't seen a full accounting of you know, how the pensions are funded. But also, state pension funds are looking over the long term, over decades, in terms of their financing. And you don't have to turn around a shortfall in a a very brief period of time in order to have them be soundly financed. What I think is really happening is just the ultra-conservatives are following Rah Emanuel's advice to never let a crisis go to waste. And in some sense, they're making better use from their ideological point of view in taking advantage of this crisis to attack public workers, to attack their pensions.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to point out the Wisconsin Employees Pension Fund is one of the best funded, if not the best funded in the country.
That's exactly right.
And they haven't done what we've done here in Illinois, which is postpone payments, drag out payments, skip payments, borrow to make payments. So the overall budget is on pretty solid financial footing. They do have a $3.6 billion or $3.5 billion projected deficit for the next 2-year budget. So break that down, that's really only 1.75 over each year.
In today's dollars, that just seems
well,
like,
when you compare it to Illinois, it is.
Right.
And the other thing is that's based on what agencies requested for the next fiscal year, not the reality that they probably wouldn't get increases.
Anyway.
And the cuts are far beyond that. to help pay for, in part, those tax breaks that the governor got through the legislature, which some Democrats did support as well, feeling that the business climate needs to change a little bit there to encourage job growth.
I don't actually know anybody on either side who doesn't think that it isn't time to have some conversation about changing the way pensions are funded, the way what our benefits are, and all that. But this seems, as you say, like the using of a crisis for a specific purpose.
I think that's what's really interesting about what happened in Wisconsin, is because once the unions came around, and it was almost immediate to agreeing, and the Democrats saying, we'll vote for the financial considerations that you want them to give up, the contributions to their health insurance and their contributions to the pension, to help erase the current fiscal year shortfall, which is really what this budget repair bill was supposed to be focused on, as just like it says, fixing the budget for this fiscal year so they could close out June 30th with a balanced budget. And they went so far beyond that, and I think that's what's really rankled people, and that there wasn't a discussion going forward that was alongside the budget that's going forward for the next 2 years about how to do that. And the public opinion polls, as was mentioned earlier by David and others, a lot of people thought the governor was overreaching, the Republicans were overreaching, and I was actually really surprised that they ended up not coming to a compromise when they had the ability to do so. They had the Democrats willing to take an awful lot off the table in terms of collective bargaining.
And if I could, so why the overreach? Why not the compromise? Why not just accept yes, for an answer and move on?
Not capable of accepting yes as an answer.
Well, because I don't know that it may be an error, but I think it's not just a sort of they didn't just stumble into this. If you take a look at what's happened to the labor movement nationwide, you realize that half the labor movement now is in its public sector workers, and this is where the growth has been, the sustaining of union membership, around 36% in the public sector, less than 7% in the private sector. Of the top 10 contributors to federal political campaigns, 7 of them, of course, give to Republicans or corporate or very conservative groups, but the 3 that aren't are 3 predominantly public sector unions. So I think there's a larger political agenda, when you talk about taking advantage of a crisis, I mean, that's the crisis. How do you explain Iowa with a surplus in their budget attacking?
Doing
well, and in a lot of these states, the governors are mixing together initiatives to attack private sector unionism as well as public sector unionism, and what does that have to do with solving any budget problems?
Here's the thing. We are Chicago Newsroom, not Wisconsin Newsroom, and the reason that I wanted to get this brain trust around the table today is to see if we could address this question of where do we think we're going now that we have Rah Emanuel as our mayor. I know it's speculation, but that's what we have to do here. It's important. It's an important part of media, is having intelligent speculation. It seems to me that many of the people who Rah Emanuel seems to be turning to are the kind of the same people, or people who think in a manner that's similar to the way Mayor Daley thought. Is it possible that Rah Emanuel, as some of the unions were running around yelling about, will be the Scott Walker of Chicago? Is that going to happen?
Well, for one thing, he doesn't have within his power a lot of the things that Walker is doing. A lot of public sector workers are covered by state law, not national labor law, but they're also not covered in terms of their rights to bargain by anything that the mayor can do. But there are things being introduced in the state legislature that would affect, such as a bill that would apply the same kind of cuts to current retirees, prospective retirees from the state government as were applied to new hires, so that to spread that cutback in that pain. Also, there are moves to restrict collective bargaining. I think the main showdown locally may come over both pensions and staffing levels.
Yeah.
You know, Mayor Daley does not have a tremendous history with the labor unions in Chicago, and contrary to his father, really didn't need them to win his first election nor re-election after.
Right. A very good point.
He really had clashed often with the firefighters, police officers, not so much the teachers, but you know, given his control over the school board the last decade. No, I guess it's 15 years now.
Yeah.
You know, there are clashes there as well, and if you look at Rah Emanuel coming out of the Mayor Daley mold, I do think that the unions, the public unions in Chicago, should be at least a little concerned that, given the fact that the city's pensions are horribly funded now and are at a crisis point, possibly, if the economy doesn't rebound and some of their holdings don't boost up again. And as well, I mean, you know, Mr. Emanuel has already said he'd like a longer school day and a longer school year. Teachers unions, when Mayor Daley has suggested this in the past, have said we're willing to discuss that as long as we're compensated fairly for those longer hours and longer school year, which the city does not seem to be in a position of. So already we could see potential conflict there. You know, the police and fire contracts, I think, were recently settled, or at least maybe the police were. But those are things that always, I mean, they're usually settling them 3 or 4 years after they expire. And it's always been a big sore spot with the police officers and the firefighters. And they did not endorse Mr. Emanuel. And many of the
all with Chico, most of them.
Laborers and others didn't back him either.
One of the things that we've kicked around this table in the last couple of weeks is this very interesting sort of political phenomenon of you have, for really the first time, certainly in modern period in Chicago, you've got a mayor who came into office really kind of more in the Bloomberg model. A lot of outside money, a lot of independent money, a guy who really didn't have to care what the garbage collectors thought of him. It doesn't matter to him what the unions think, because he has a way of getting elected by just sort of funneling money in from outside. Now that's an oversimplification, and it may not last, but at least for now, I mean, for example, Bob, where is the CTU? What kind of bargaining power does the CTU have with this new mayor who doesn't seem to have any real allegiance to them at all?
I'm glad David mentioned the public school system and the teachers union. I think that's really where you're going to see a significant clash. I mean, I think it's building up. So where will that leverage come from? Frankly, it's going to come from a different approach to mobilizing membership and educating membership. I think Karen Lewis has been very good at putting together a staff and a group core that can govern that union and can reach out to its rank and file. And so they're involved in a long-range campaign to prepare their members for what could be some serious clashes as this contract expires. And so it will really come from the sense of grievance that exist in all of those schools, and it will depend just how well they've done in creating leaders in all of those schools. I think they're preparing for a mayor and a school system that's going to be very hostile as this contract ends.
We're literally down to our last 5 minutes, and I don't want to crash up against the last minute here. So
let me pick up on what we just talked about here in terms of the taking it back to Wisconsin. One of the things that Scott Walker has done in his budget that hasn't been too widely reported is an increase in funding for charter schools, for choice program in Milwaukee that's been in existence for a while, that's been very controversial, that has showed very mixed results. And there clearly is a desire to go in that direction there. And I think people here are watching what's happening in the North in terms of what can be done in Chicago public schools, in terms of we've had a big explosion of charter schools. They're looking to make the next step. I don't know if we go as far as choice. I don't know where things go, but certainly there are going to be some conflicts, I think, in terms of how schools are run, how schools are operated, what staffing levels are like.
And you have I'm sorry, Dave,
what
just
pay
real
is
quickly, you have this whole sort of White House connection here too, with Arnie Duncan and these guys.
I'm not sure Arnie Duncan's is any particular help though to the agenda of the teachers.
No,
right,
quite to the contrary.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
No, I was going to say, I mean, the leverage that ultimately the teachers union has is their ability to strike. And that's why it's interesting that one of the major business and rich folk funded groups in the city that's pushing charter schools to stand for children is also the group that is behind this proposed legislation in the state to take away the right to strike from teachers, as well as to restrict their rights to collectively bargain. So, in a way, we see those restrictions from Wisconsin in a much milder form beginning to be introduced here.
Even in this more democratic state?
Well, unfortunately, even by Democrats in some cases, there's a move led by Madigan's top aide to eliminate the right to be in a union for about 4,000 state employees who recently joined the union. It actually, most of them ran to the union in order to become members because they saw what was happening to employees in state government. And they wanted some kind of protection.
I think we're seeing across the board in government, state governments and local governments, a little less so on the federal side because it's a completely different structure, that a realization, Democrat and Republican, in the weight of the costs of things like pension funds, health care plans, and a desire to change things moving forward, if using the schools for an example, that just trying to get the best bang for our buck. And I think that there's a lot of frustration, and I think it's legitimate that for taxpayers and parents and people feeling like they should be getting more. And I understand that there's a lot of people who want it all without paying for it. And don't really realize everything that they're getting for their tax dollar now. But I do think that there is some legitimacy to the concerns that unions may be in some ways holding back progress. And I don't know that you can say that across the board about every union. And
I mean, that perception. It's one thing to say.
It's the McCormick Place electrician thing.
Right.
$85
to plug it. So you have that perception, and you have to confront that. But I mean, it is really important to take a good hard look at what states are spending money on and what's being spent here. And when you take a good look at that, and this is being done, these studies are being reported, you really find out that these collective bargaining agreements are not bankrupting these states. When 80% of retirees collecting a public pension in Illinois are going to earn less than $50,000. That's clearly not where.
And there are pension problems, much greater proportion in the non-collective bargaining
Texas,
states,
North Carolina,
where public employees.
And we do have. I guess I just saw the stats today. It's like 78 is now the new. Whatever you call that, the longevity, the age of longevity in the United States. So we we can't be, letting people retire at 55 years old and all that. We know all that. Okay, final thought. The final thought. Where are we? What do you...
Well, I'll start out. I think these elections in Wisconsin are going to be very, very telling in how far people want to go there. And I do think that there are repercussions in Illinois and elsewhere, because if there is, if the recall petitions end up being valid and more than a few of these Republican state senators are removed from office, the Supreme Court election goes to a Democrat, I think that would be a sign that maybe the Republicans overreached there, and you'll see other states dial it back.
David, we're going to have to leave it right there. That's David Schaper from NPR, David Moberg from In These Times, and Bob Bruno from the University of Illinois. Thank you all so much for being with us today. A very interesting conversation. We'll pick it up another time, too. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. Of course, you can see us here all the time on cable, but you can also watch us on cantv.blip.tv. Check us out there, subscribe on iTunes and all the rest of that. And we want to thank you once again for joining us here on this rather somber version of Chicago Newsroom. We'll see you next time. Thanks.